In this lesson, we are going to be constructing some dummy JSON data that then we're going to use that constructed data, so randomized data, into a web application. In this case, we're going to be building out another quiz. And this is going to be really a simple model. We're not focusing on any of the styling in this lesson, as it's all about constructing the JSON object. So we've got the object being constructed here as a JavaScript object, and you can output it as JSON data onto the page, and that will also give you the opportunity to make sure it's valid JSON data. And when you do use it within the lint, it is a whole lot easier to read through the data contents. And as well, you can read it within the console. So you can see our basic construction of the JSON object is going to be with a question, and then we've got an option for random number of options here. So these are all generated. This is all generated data. And I'm also going to be going through how we can output that content on the page. So we can do a document write of the content, and this is going to output the newly constructed JSON object. So this is all random, and that's what we're doing in this lesson, as we really want to focus on being able to construct valid JSON objects that we can use within web applications. So let's get started coding and build this application. Open up the editor, create your basic HTML shell, and then open it up within the browser. So just as I have it here, on the left-hand side, I've got my code editor, and then on the right-hand side, I've got the code opened up within the browser window, and the DevTools opened at the bottom, as we're going to be demonstrating how to generate some JSON data. And this is going to be dummy data that we're going to use in order to simulate a quiz-like type format. So good practice to get more familiar with JSON. And then connect it, create a new JavaScript file, and this is the fourth project within this section. So go ahead and create Pro4, and then open up the JavaScript file, and we can start getting coding with the JavaScript code. So we want to select some of the elements on the page. We want to select the output area, and then also make the button clickable. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll select the output area using the document and query selector, and selecting the element with a class of output. So this will populate the output variable with that, assigning it to the element on the page. And then also we did have a button, so making that button clickable, we need to select the element first. So using query selector, let's select the element, and with the class of btn, and select both of those, and just double check that we do have them properly selected. And you can do that within the console. So when you make the variable, when you type in the variable, if you hover over it within the console, it's also going to hover over the element on the page. And also let's try the button one, just to make sure that we do have the button selected properly. So what we want to do is, once the button gets clicked, we want to add an event listener to the button that's gonna start our default quiz. So we can add the event listener in there. And what this is going to do, when we click the button, it's going to start the game. And we need to still, of course, generate the dummy JSON data. So let's create all of our main functions that we're going to need. So it's going to start the game. And this is just going to be a simulation of the quiz content. So type in here that it was clicked, and we can output a message into the console. So that means our button is ready to go. So we also want to generate some data. So let's create a holder, so temporary data. And this is going to be the core focus of this lesson, is the temporary data that we're generating. So we want to, whenever the page loads, and we can kick this off by window, add event listener, and listen for DOM content loaded. And once the DOM content gets loaded, then we can init, and we'll create a function in order to handle that as well. So init function, and this is the function that's going to run, that's going to load the JSON or create the JSON data. So once the page loads, and we'll also output into the console just a variable, just a value of ready. So we know that this function is kicking off whenever the web page loads. So let's make some updates, and we're going to generate the quiz content and create that using JavaScript. So generate quiz data, and we'll create a function that's going to handle that. and can do that function just below here. So generate the quiz data function. We're not passing any parameters, and it's going to just simply populate the temp data with some JSON data. And then that JSON data, then we can output it onto the page and make use of it. So also let's do a document write. And the content that we're going to write is going to be the JSON stringified version of the temp data. So we can see the temp data as we're constructing it on the page. And right now there's nothing within the temp data. So let's generate some content, and we want to create a kind of a quiz-like structure. So depending on how many questions we want to have, let's create a for loop and the questions that we have. So starting with an index value of 0, and then loop through while questions is less than 5. So that will generate 5 questions, and you can update these variables as we continue to generate them. So we want to create a temporary holder, and this can just be a blank array so that we have some content that we want to populate in. And this is going to hold the possible options that we have. So how many options that we want to generate. And this can actually, we'll do this using a random value. So math floor, and using math random, multiply it by 3, and then we're going to add 2 to that value. So within the for loop, so starting out with the ops is equal to 0, and then we're going to loop through while ops is less than ran, and increase ops by 1. So these are the options that we're going to providing for our dummy data. And let's create a temporary object. So how we want to structure the data within the questions. So these are the options. So we'll have one for the result and try option, and then whatever we want the text for the option. And I'm actually going to use the backticks. And I know that I'm creating it as a JavaScript object, but when we do the stringify, it's going to transform the content into JSON data. So you can as well, in order to practice writing JSON, you can format it within a JSON format as well. But because I am using the backticks, and this is a JavaScript object that we're simply depositing, that's why I'm still using the JavaScript format. And then with the $sign and the curly brackets, I can take in the value of ops, and I'm going to add just 1 to it. And then comma separate out, and whether it's correct or not. So similar to what we did within the earlier quiz. And this actually should be question. So put an X there by mistake. So now we're looping through, and what we want to do is we want to push the options into the holder array. So as we generate them, we push the new option object value into the array. So take the temporary object and push that. And then once we're finished and looping through, this is when we can add in the temporary object into the array. So let's construct temporary object. And I'm doing this so that we have an opportunity to update and add a question, and then have an object with answers. So these are the possible options for answers. And this again is coming from that holder array that we're constructing. And then let's take the temp data and push the newly constructed question into it. And that information is going to be contained within the temp object. And before we conclude this function, we'll log out the temp object just to see that we've got some content in there. So it looks like we're got undefined generate, and actually this should be outputting temp data. So there's our newly constructed array. There's our answers, or our possible answers. And it's actually not putting it on the page because while it's running, so it's running those synchronously. So let's, after we've constructed the temp data, that's when we can output it to the page and stringify it. And actually, let's fix this. So it's not actually, we're not doing a document write equals sign because this is expecting a method. So a quick correction there on the syntax. So that outputs the newly created object into the web page. Let's go over to the JSON lint and validate that we do have a valid JSON object. And this way we can see the newly created object that we've created. And you can also update and play around with the values. And this is just a simulation of how you can construct your JavaScript JSON object that you're going to use within the application. And of course, if you needed more properties here within the object, you can add those in as well. And this can just have whatever the value of ops is or some other details and information. So when we refresh, and do need to save that. And now when we take the newly constructed JSON, just validate it, and now we've got that additional value in that object. So we also want to have a correct answer. Try option and wrong. So we'll output that into the object. And then we're updating the answers. And this is also where we can generate a question value. So if we are creating a quiz, so this can hold the question. So using the backticks again, and this can be Q with a number sign and then the $sign to bring in whatever question we're on. So we're going through the QES and add 1 to it. And what is the correct answer? So we can just update whatever the ran 1 is or whatever we want. And we do have a value for ran there. So let's output that and see what we've got now. So again, you can, in order to read it, I know when it is in the stringified version is a little bit hard to read. So that's why the linting and validating that it's JSON is a good way to check it out. So now we've got the question, we've got an array of answers. We still need to have a correct answer. So let's add that in. So after we've got all of the answers array, we're gonna add in the new option for correct answer. And we wanna structure it the same way as this object. And this is the temporary correct. Can say pick this one, and this value is going to be true, and then this can be 100 or whatever we want. So just so that we have this consistent structure for the object, and then of course we do need to add that into the holder array and push in the correct answer so that we always have at least one correct answer in our dummy data. Let's again take that and put into the lint, make sure we've got valid JSON, and then just take a closer look at what we've got. So we'd have 3 incorrect answers, 1 correct answer, we've got a question, and again we've got, in this example, we've got 4 incorrect answers, 1 correct answer, and so on. So we've effectively built an object, a JSON object, that we can use as dummy data within a quiz application. And then I'll show you how to create a quiz out of this dummy data really quickly. But the main objective of this lesson is to focus on going through what we have available for us within and constructing a JSON object that we can then use within a web application. So let's start the game. So once we have the data loaded, and before we load the data, and I'm just going to set this to disabled equals true. So that way the button can't be clicked, and I'll remove out the document write of the JSON data as we've already seen it. So the button can't be clicked, and we only want to enable it when we have actually loaded the data. So at this point we're going to set this to false. So the user can click the button, they can start the game. And let's button and update the text content of the button. Start game quiz. And let's select the H1 object as well. So selecting the H1 element from the page, and that way we can update the H1 element. And this actually should be const. So selecting the H1 element, and let's update the text content. And give it a name. So that way when it's ready, we can hit the start the game. And that way we can kick off and start the game. So we do have an object that we've constructed, and we can loop through each one of the questions there that we have. So let's set for a game object. And this is an object that we can use. So whatever the current one is going to be 0. And then also let's add in a score as well. So whenever the user gets the correct answer, the score can increase. So we can have the score here at the top. So once it gets clicked, we'll update the value of it, and then we'll hide the button. So btn1 style and display, and set that to none for the display. So once it gets clicked, it's going to hide the button. And this is one of the best ways to work through the game, is kind of play through it as if you were playing through the actual game. So what's the next step here? We want to display the question. So let's create a function to display the question. And then this is going to move to the displaying the question. And we're going to remove out the question from the temp data array. Let's output the question content to the page. So we're hiding the button, and then we're just moving on to the next question that's in line. So it's going to generate the question. And then we'll add in the conditions afterwards to check to see if we still have any questions left and which question we're on. And this time we're going to be just moving through and updating the value of L. So within the game object, whatever the current element is that we're on, that's the value. So it's the game current, and we're just going to select it from the array index. So taking the temp data array and returning back whatever the current game value is going to be. So this is going to represent the question that we want to use. And let's console log out the question before we put it out onto the web page. So when we start the game, there's our question. So within the question object, let's construct those elements. So this is going to be the main parent div. And using the document and create element. So let's create a main parent div that's going to hold the content. And then also we'll create one for the question. And this is going to be the document create element, and this can be an H3 value. So this is going to be where we're going to place the question. And within the question, update the text content, and using the question object that we just got and outputting the property value of question. And then let's append these items to the page, and then we're going to loop through and output the possible options for the answers. So selecting the question content, and then let's take output and append the content into there. So we're going to be appending the div into there, and then within the div we're going to be appending the question object. And we also want to clear out output. So let's update the inner HTML and just clear that out so we don't have any content in there. So there's our question being presented. And now we want to loop through all of the answers. And just as we did earlier, where we've got a number of answers, we can sort the array. So the question and answers, this is an array. So that gives us an option to loop through the answers object. So we've got the array there listed for this one, and we've got the 3 items there. So we want to randomize it and let's use the sort with the compare function. So randomize compare function, where we're going to return back random values. So it's going to be either negative or positive, and then this can randomize the array sort order. So now we're not going to always have the correct answer as the last one. So once we've randomized the sort order, so take question, answers, and then going for each one, looping through, and let's output the questions into a new div. And this is going to be where our div is going to hold. So div 1, and append to div, we're going to append the div 1. So this is going to be our main holder for the possible options. And let's create one. So these are the selectable options using document create element, and we can create them as buttons. And then to div 1, append the selection option, and within the selects, let's update the text content to be whatever the element and response value is going to be. So start the quiz, and there's our options there. Again, start the quiz. So obviously we know which one is the correct one. So let's add an event listener to that, and the event listener is going to be listening for a click. And once it gets clicked, then it can run this function. And this is a function where we're going to check to see which one is right, and then also remove out the other possible options. So we want to loop through this main div, and let's create a function that's going to disable buttons. And this is going to be whatever element we want to disable the buttons. So element and query selector all, and this is going to select all of the elements within that main element. So this way, if we want to disable the buttons on all of the buttons within div 1, we can just do this within the one function. And this just cleans up the code. Of course, you could do the same function here where you can loop through them all, and it just cleans up the click code. So query selector all, and it's going to select all of the elements that are buttons. And for now, we'll just console log the else object there. So when we click one, we've got the node list of all of the buttons. So we want to loop through this node list using for each one, and these are going to be the buttons. So we want to disable the buttons, and we want to remove the event listener. So what we can do is, instead of removing the event listener, we can take the else disabled and set that to true. So once you make a selection, and actually we need to select the buttons, that's why they're not disabling. So once we make a selection, it's going to disable all of the buttons. And we can then show the next question. So we can do the display and then update whatever we've got for button 1. So display that as block, and then button 1, and update the text content. Next question. So we got our option to move on to the next question. And here we can also do the check to see if the button was correct. So within this array of answers, we have a Boolean value that's correct or incorrect. So if this element that was clicked, so we're checked to see the element, and if it's correct, then we'll output into the console for now correct, and otherwise we'll output into the console wrong. And then update those. So we test it first within the console message, and I'm going to pick the correct one, so clear out the console. So we got that correct, And this time I'll clear it out and I'll get the wrong one. So we got it wrong. So that's working. And now we can take the select button, apply a style and background color and set that to green if we got it right. And otherwise we'll set it to red if we got it wrong. So add in that type of feedback to the user. So it goes green if it's right, red if it's wrong. We can also update the score. So game score is going to increase. So game score, and we'll just add to that. So score increases if we get it right. And also maybe we want to have some feedback here within the H1. Or we might just want to add to the output inner HTML and just add to that. You got it right. So that will save us of having a separate element. And let's try it one more time. This time get the, so great, you got it right. And then we're ready to move on to the next question. Of course, we haven't applied any styling to this, but it's providing us the feedback. And now we can move on to the next question. So game current is going to increase once we've made a selection. Once we run the disable the buttons, so increase it by 1. And then it should generate the next question within the array. And it's already moving to the next question over here. So it's automatically going to, whenever we pick one, it should move to the next question. So it's moving on to question 3, and then question 4, and question 5. And then at this point it's going to fail because we don't have any condition to stop it from moving past what available elements we have within the array. So we need to still do some troubleshooting and debugging of the application. And also we need to provide the user some information about what question they're on. So instead of outputting that value here, let's, when we're moving to the next question, we can update the text there and just write that with the backticks. And it can say of, and then to find out how many items we have, temp data length, questions. So we're on 0, because it's 0 base, we need to add 1 to that. So we're on question 1 of 5, now we're on 2 of 5, now we're on 3 of 5, 4 of 5, and 5 of 5. And if we go to 6, then we don't have any more questions. So we need to add in a condition to catch that error and that issue. Let me update the code view to toggle the word wrap so that we can get all of the code on the same page. And the next lesson, we'll put some finishing touches on it and do some debugging and some styling to our application. So the main objective, again, was to go through and build a working JSON data model that we can then use within an application. The tasks for this lesson are to use and create in order to simulate a JSON object that can be used within a quiz application or any application. So the objective, again, is to really focus on constructing proper valid JSON data and plan out the property values that you're going to need it for your application. And then to ensure that it is valid JSON object, you can output it using the JSON stringify method and output it to the page using the document write and try it out within a JSON validator. And then create a simple application that's going to be dynamically driven by the JSON data that you've just generated. And you can be ready to move on to the next lesson. We're going to be applying some styling to this application.